Hey, welcome. So today we're going to talk all about registering a block setting. So this is not a core WordPress feature. We're going to use a library for this, but we're also going to use some core WordPress stuff as well. So let's take a look at what a block setting is so we kind of get an idea of what we're trying to build. So let's say I select this group block right here. A block setting is essentially any of these kind of toolbar buttons up here, turning on the width and stuff like that. Or maybe on the sidebar here, let's say I pick this group block and then I look here and I have a little toggle setting that I can turn on and off and some extra stuff here where I can pick the justification, things like that, things like setting the colors. These are all settings for blocks. And so there's actually a pretty cool API we're going to use to inject our own settings. Now, what that means is we're not going to change really the structure of what gets rendered in a block. What it's really just going to let us do is turn on or off a class on the block. So we're kind of limited here to adding a class to the outermost element of block and turning it off. But you can do a lot of powerful things just by turning a class on and off. For example, the alignment. All we're doing here is adding a class and it's handling that feature. So it's similar to that. Anything you can do with CSS, you can kind of accomplish just by adding a class to an element. Beyond that, there's probably some fancier things you could do, parsing the HTML or something like that. But at that point, just make a custom block. But if you just want to take a core block, add a little setting to it, this is the tutorial for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some responsive block settings. So we're going to add a little setting here where we can do different visibility things at different sizes. So let's jump into our code editor and look at what we're building. So I've started a plugin, and in this plugin, I don't really have anything except a README file, my main plugin header file, and a package.json. But what we're going to do is add a couple dependencies. So I've already added them, but you'll want to add them as well. So we have WordPress Scripts. What that is a build process for WordPress. It's basically Webpack, but it does a lot of things that make it a lot easier when you're building something for WordPress in JavaScript. So we're going to use that. I will say one caveat, it's kind of meant for building blocks. So sometimes it doesn't do exactly what you want, but it's does enough things that makes it worth using. We're also going to install the 10up block components library as a dependency. You might have seen this in some videos I've done before. It's just a really great package that just adds a lot of really cool developer goodies to the block editor when you're trying to build stuff. So we're going to actually use this registerBlockExtension API they've invented. What it basically does is does all the backend work for you and makes it really easy to add settings to blocks and inject classes into it. I use it all the time. It's really helpful and really simple once you get the hang of it. So we're going to use it, and then we're going to take the CSS and write it so that we can add a little responsive settings to our blocks. And then finally, I'm just copying this from the WordPress Scripts package library. So I'm going to use these commands that come with WordPress Scripts already. And so there'll be a link to the documentation for that, but I just copy in their scripts and I use them. So let's open up our terminal. I've already installed everything. So we're just going to do npm run start, and that's just going to turn on the build process. What the build process is always going to look for is a little source folder. So we're going to make a new folder for source. And then what it's going to do is look for a block.json file if you have one, because like I said, it's really meant for blocks. And if you don't, it's going to look for an index.js file. So we're going to do index.js. And you can see here at first it kind of couldn't find anything. Now it could. And what it's always going to do is look for that index.js as its entry point and compile anything that you need. And it's going to throw it into the build script. And then it's going to give you some extra stuff. It doesn't just give you the file compiled. It also gives you this asset.php. And what this gives us is here's all the dependencies that I'm going to need and the version number. So when we enqueue this piece of JavaScript that we're writing for the block editor, we're actually going to use it. And it's kind of great because as we start importing things, it gets pretty smart at incorporating those dependencies from WordPress. So the first thing we need to do is import that register block extension that we were talking about. Register block extension from 10up block components. So that's the function we're going to use. And then we're going to write a bunch of other functions that kind of like will feed into it. And then we're going to call register block extension once we have everything working together. So let's start by adding our register block extension. See, it already kind of knows a little bit. The first parameter we're going to pass it is actually going to be an array of blocks that we want this to work on. So we want to use the core group block, and then we're actually going to add it to the core column block. So not the columns block that holds all the columns, but actually the individual column, and you'll see why. And then we get to pass it some settings. We'll start with the extension name, and I'm just going to call this responsive settings. That's just going to be a nice backend name for what we want to do. Next, it's going to take attributes. So similar to a block.json file, we want an array or an object full of attributes that we're going to add to a block. Let's look at an example block to get an idea of like what an attribute is. So here's an example block.json file just from a core WordPress block, and attributes is just one of the things you pass it. And what attributes basically is like custom values that kind of get stored with your block when you use it in the block editor. So it's kind of almost like custom fields for a block. So what we're doing is we're going to create a couple attributes, kind of like custom fields. We're going to make some settings. We'll save those values in those attributes, save those kind of custom fields. And then when it renders the block, we're going to look at those values and determine what CSS classes we want to add to the like outermost element of our block. So when we're building out attributes, we're kind of thinking about this same exact schema that you would see here, where you have the name of the attribute and maybe what type it is and maybe what default is. So let's add our attributes, and I'm going to just call it additional attributes. I'm just going to close this so it doesn't get mad at me. And we'll come up here and we'll define what our attributes we want. So we're going to have two different attributes. The first one is going to be called has responsive settings, and that's going to be a Boolean. It's going to be true or false. Do they have the responsive settings turned on or not? Just like that toggle that we saw, true or false, and we'll default it to false. Then we're going to have has responsive display, and that's going to be kind of the value that we're storing. In this case, it's going to be a string. Okay, and I'll save that. So we're adding two new attributes. Imagine the block.json of our block. We've added two new attributes to it. I'm going to open this up a little bit, get a little more room, and we're going to pass those attributes to registerBlockExtension. So we've given it a name, we told it what blocks we want to edit, and these are the attributes that we want to give it. We want, do we want the responsive settings that we're building turned on or off or not? And what do we want the value of it to be? And so those are the two initial settings. So the next parameter we need to pass here is going to actually be our edit function. So in this case, what we actually are going to pass it is a React component that we're going to call block edit. Now, block edit is going to be basically a React component, just like the edit of a block in general. So if you've ever built a block, this is a very similar thing, which is it's a React component. It takes props, it takes those attributes that we're defining up here. It lets you set them, it lets you edit them. And then what you get to do after that is use WordPress's core components to sort of build a UI. So when you're building out this edit screen, let's go back and see what options we have. Like I said before, when you edit a block, there's two places you can do it. There's this toolbar right here, and there's the sidebar, what's called the InspectorControls. So we're going to use either one of those components, and we're going to pass it, and we're basically going to have that option to either add some stuff here or add some settings here. And in this case, we're going to go with InspectorControls. That's where we're going to add our settings. So in order to do that, first we're going to have to import it. We're going to import InspectorControls from WordPress block editor package. So we'll be importing some stuff from the components later, but right now we're importing from the block editor package because that's where these sort of like block editor specific things live. And I'm going to save it. And just to show you what WordPress is doing in the back end, this build process, remember that we have going on over here? If I come over here and I open this, remember that dependencies was just nothing before. Now it knows in order to load our piece of JavaScript, these are all the things it's going to need to load, all the like other JavaScript files, and they're already being loaded by the block editor. It's just letting it know kind of like where ours fits in. But all of this stuff is going to be set as a dependency, and when we enqueue the script and stuff, we're actually going to see all that. So just by putting this here, that's kind of what WordPress Scripts does for you, and it's pretty cool when you're in that WordPress environment. So let's just start with our return function, and we'll come up again and we will add kind of all the other stuff that we need, but we're just going to start with InspectorControls. So InspectorControls is like a slot fill component in the block editor, meaning we can use this open and close tag and we can put anything we want. And what this API is going to do is it's actually going to hook into any block that we tell it, in this case, these two blocks, and it's going to inject it right where we need it. So we're going to use some more WordPress core components here to kind of build out what the design would look like. And I have a good feeling that Copilot's going to do a lot of this writing for me. So especially because I've just written it before, so maybe it's fresh in its mind. But let's see. So we are going to use a panel body component, and you can see here we haven't imported it, but we will. And inside of that, I actually want to do a panel row. Oops. So I'm a fan of the panel row. And then we're going to do a toggle control. And a toggle control is just like we looked at before, a little like true false component. And so all of these are just components that come from WordPress core. And so We're going to add some settings, but for now, we're just going to close all of these so it doesn't yell at us, and we're going to save it. So we're going to build out in React components here. But in order to use all of these, we do have to import them. So let's head over to the top. Let's just accept that. So WordPress components library, that's where all that UI comes from. So we're going to import a couple UI components, and we're going to pass them into the block editor's inspector controls. And then we're going to start adding some props to it. Now you might be wondering, where did these components come from? Where can I see what components are available? That's where the WordPress, GitHub repos really come in handy. You can kind of dig into like each of these packages inside the Gutenberg repository, or you can go to this storybook, which is maintained by Gutenberg, and it essentially has this component section here. So for example, we're picking the ToggleControl. So we're going to scroll all the way down right to ToggleControl, and you can see an example of it here. You can see all the different properties it takes, and you can head into this doc section where you can see exactly how they use it. So like the same way we're doing it, right? They're just using it the same way. So that's one place you can come to kind of know which components you want to use. So in this case, we want that toggle control. We want that true false. So let's actually build out the logic here, and then we'll enqueue it and we'll kind of look at it on the front end. So first we'll pass it a label, enable responsive settings. Looks good to me. Now, do we want it true or false? Well, that's going to be based on our responsive settings attribute. So if it's checked, if the responsive settings is true, and if it's false, it'll not be checked. And that's just coming straight out of our attributes, similar to any other block. And last, we'll need an onChange function. And instead of that, we're just going to name a function. We'll call it set responsive settings. And then we just need to write that function. So we're going to write it as part of our component here. I like to make little separate functions for things. I think it's a little cleaner, but that's really up to anybody else. So we have props.setAttributes. That's just something that comes with props. Some people like to kind of deconstruct this, but for this case, it's kind of simple to just do it this way. So we're actually going to set our hasResponsive setting attribute to whatever the value that we're passing it here. And we'll close that and save it. So what we've done here is we've hooked into InspectorControls, we put in a little panel, and we added a little toggle control to set this true or false. And before we pass this into the block editor to get it working, there's actually one more function we need to add. That's called the class name generator. And this is, we'll just write a function. We'll call it generate class name. And we just need to define that function. And what we'll do is we'll actually, we'll just return a string for now. But this is actually a function that's going to grab the logic of our attributes and just like add some classes to it. But it's not going to work unless we have all of these parameters kind of available here. So we've added the class name generator. We've added the block edit. We've added our attributes. And so we should be able to at least see it in the block editor and see how it's going to work. Now, this isn't going to work yet because all we've done so far is build our JavaScript, but we haven't actually told WordPress to enqueue this JavaScript when we're on the block editor. So that's actually standard WordPress stuff. We're going to head back to our main plugin PHP file, and we're going to write a little enqueue script function here. Okay, so I've written a function, but what I'm going to do here is we're going to walk through what it is. So first thing we do is we grab our asset file. So remember this asset file here that's automatically generated by WordPress Scripts. We kind of grab it here and we use include. And what that's actually going to do is it's going to take what's returned here, this array right here, and kind of pass it into a variable for us. So we're basically just saying, get us these two things, the version and the dependencies, as an array when we enqueue. And what's great about this too is like every time it recompiles, it triggers this version number kind of randomly. So we can actually, like, if we update a file and we enqueue it and we're pulling the version number straight from here, it's going to kind of like refresh it automatically. You don't get stuck with like old JavaScript in your cache. So beyond that, it's just a WP enqueue script. I'm going to call it example block settings. I'm going to pass it the URL to that JavaScript file from our build folder that's being built. It's what's in our source folder, but just being compiled, and it kind of looks like that. And, I don't know what it means, but that's what it looks like once it's all compiled. And then just like a normal WP enqueue script, we pass it, the dependencies, we pass it the version number and whether we want it in the footer. So I'm pulling that dependency straight out of the asset file. I'm pulling the version number straight out of that asset file. And so if I import new things, it's going to update this for me. And then we're loading in the footer. And the final thing is we're actually using the enqueue block editor assets action because we want this enqueued for the block editor, not enqueued, for the front of somebody's website. This is a script that's meant to load with the block editor. So with all of this running, our simple JavaScript should be able to load. Okay, so we're in our block editor. I'm going to click on our group block. And I can see right here, we have our responsive settings panel that we added with our responsive settings toggle here as well. So we can see that the panel is loading in the InspectorControls and our setting is here. It doesn't do anything yet, but it's available. It's there. It's loaded as part of our block. And then we also put it as part of our column block, right? So if I select the column, yep, I should see it here as well. So the block setting is available. Let's keep building out our settings. Let's build those class names. Let's see if we can get it to do something. So now that we have the enable responsive settings, what we really want to do is add another row, but we're going to do it conditionally based on if the toggle is set to true. So is the toggle set to true? Yes. If so, then spit out this next section of content for us. Otherwise, don't show them these options if they don't really have them. So we'll start with another panel row because we're creating a new row. And in this one, we're actually going to use something called SelectControl. So it's similar to how a toggle control is a toggle field. This one will be a select field, a drop-down field. And let's just close everything to make it feel nice and clean. And then we'll start building out our settings here. So the select control will have a label, responsive display. That's what we're going to do. So I'm kind of basing this off of what a lot of page builders do, but what we're going to do is we're going to build a little drop down and it's going to say, where do I want to show this group? Do I want to show it on, mobile only, mobile and tablet, tablet only, tablet and desktop, or desktop only? So you can kind of, selectively display where you want a block or like a group or a column to display. And then you can kind of have the option to do like different mobile and desktop versions of content. That's kind of the idea here. So it's something that, it's kind of been mentioned a lot on the internet and I thought it would be fun to kind of just build it out. I personally don't know that I'd want to see this in core, but I kind of want to see what you could do for it, just, for your own projects and just a good way to learn like how the block settings work, how easy it is to add these settings. Okay, let's add our label position to the left, just a little design touch. So the value is going to be binding to our has responsive display. So that's this string right here, right? So whatever they pick in the dropdown, that's the string option that's going to be assigned here. Now we need to pass the select control an array of options. So here's those options I was kind of talking about earlier. Do we want it on all sizes and that all value is the default? So that's what they would see when they initially turn it on. Do I want it on small, small and medium, medium, large, large only? I think, page builders, I've seen this in Beaver Builder. It's a pretty common way to just where do I want this block to display at what screen sizes? And then lastly, we do need that on change. And instead of passing a function, we're just going to say set responsive display. So similar to what we did with the other one, it's just a nice function to handle the change. We're just going to copy, let our Copilot write it for us. But what we're doing here is, when that function gets called, props.setAttributes will basically handle assigning that new value to the attribute. So it gets stored there, stored as part of the block. And this is, very close to how you would do things if you were actually building a block and doing this same sort of thing. And of course, there's one last thing we have to do. We have to make sure we import that new component, that select control, because we did just add that. So let's make sure we get that from our components. Let's go check out the front end. Let's see if it's working. Okay, so we're back in the block editor. Let's pick a group block here. Let's go to our responsive settings panel. Let's turn it on, and there we go. Responsive display, all sizes, which was our default. And then we can see all the options there. So we can turn it on and off based on those sizes. So the setting is working. Let's turn it on. Let's go to say medium only, right? And let's hit update. Let's just reload the page and just make sure that our value, there it is, it's being saved, it's being taken care of. And, what's also happening is that these these settings are, being bind to the attributes. And so what we're going to do now is we're just going to take those settings and make sure that they display as classes on the element. Then we'll add some CSS, get those classes to actually do something. So now that we've been able to set these attributes, let's head down to our class name generator. And that's our function here. And what we're going to do is we're going to do let string equal nothing. And then we'll return the string at the end. And we have the attributes being passed right here. So they're available to us. We can check them. So why don't we just say, if they have responsive settings, if that's turned on true, and let's just make sure that there's a value here. Even if the value is all, I don't mind. Let's leave that just as long as there's a value. I want to make sure that there's a value for both of these. If there is, then my string basically needs to add those values. So this is basically writing it for me, but let's break it down. We have a string. If our attributes are turned on, we have responsive settings, we have a responsive display value. Add this class has responsive settings, and add this class has responsive display, and then we stick in the variable here. So it might say has responsive display small, has responsive display small medium, has responsive display medium. So it's going to pull from all of that. So that's how we're going to use it. And then what's going to happen is when we save this, if we go edit our block and we add these attributes, it should actually add those classes into the block. So let's go see if it's working. Okay, so let's click on our block. We have our responsive settings here. It's turned on. We have it set to medium only. So if we inspect this, we should see the class on it. So let's open up the inspector, and then I'll just open the little class drawer here so you can see all the classes that are on this group block. And you can see here has responsive settings, has responsive display medium. So those classes are in here. They've been assigned, and let's actually change it. So let's say small only. You'll see that refreshes, and this goes to has responsive display small. So it's reacting, it's updating the classes based on what we picked. And now we can just style that block with some CSS, and we can have a setting that affects the front end of our website. So at this point, we've basically written all of the JavaScript we really need to write for this. We've defined our attributes. We've handled some functions to update those attributes and some UI in our component so that the user can edit the attributes. We update the block by modifying the class name, and we run that all through this function that we, were provided by an open source library. So super quick, super easy. The next thing we need to do is add some CSS and load it with the blocks so that you actually see some effects of it. So in our source folder, we're going to make a new file. We're going to call it style.scss, and I'm just going to add something to it like WP block group, and just do that and save it. Now you'll notice that it doesn't get built, and that's because the WordPress Scripts library is really meant for editing blocks, and it really doesn't just pay attention to everything. It pays attention to very specific things. So in our index.js, we have to actually import it, style.css. And basically that's our way of telling WordPress Scripts and telling Webpack, please load this CSS file into the build process. So I save it. Now you can see it gets generated here. Let's just say I stick some CSS in here just so it gets built. And so then it gets compiled. And, another kind of weirdness about this is because we're using WordPress Scripts, you don't get to name things as much as you'd like. So it really helps to stick with index.js and style.scss to be able to pick names for things, because WordPress is not going to give you some extra options to deal with that. So let's build out our Sass file, and then let's get to the process of enqueuing it. So why don't we start with enqueuing it? So let's write a function to enqueue our block assets. This will be a little more traditional to WordPress here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make an array of what blocks that we want to enqueue these to. So one of the nice things about WordPress is that when you enqueue CSS to a block, you can actually say enqueue it just for this block. And on a lot of sites, especially block themes and stuff, if that block isn't on the page anywhere, the CSS file doesn't get enqueued on the front end, and it's super performant. So it's this really great thing where when you add a setting to a block, it's super nice to enqueue your style sheet directly to that block. And even if it's small enough, WordPress might even throw it in line and really cut down on requests and stuff. So it's a great performance thing. It doesn't get used enough. So let's just say we want it on our core column, and our other block is the core group. And then we're just going to loop through these blocks and enqueue it to each one because we're doing block settings on 2 different blocks, so we kind of just want it for both. And so the function we're going to use is called WP Enqueue block style, and unfortunately it doesn't always show up in your code editor because it's kind of a new file. So what we do is we pass it the block name. So we're looping through these blocks, and for each block as block, we're enqueuing the style to this block, and then the rest of the args are pretty similar to some WordPress stuff. So it wants to know the handle. What are we going to call this? We'll just call it example block settings. It's the name of our plugin. It's what we used here. It's just kind of nice handle. And then it wants to know the source of where to find it. So in this case, very similar to this, we're just, grabbing it out of the build folder here. I think this probably needs a slash, but I could be wrong. And that should be the end of that. Let's save it, but we just need to add this to an action. The action we're actually going to use is after setup theme. There's a little bit of weirdness here where if you actually enqueue this to like enqueue block assets or WP enqueue scripts or something, it's like too late. So after setup theme is kind of a good place to enqueue your block styles. And I think it makes sense because probably a lot of themes are enqueuing styles for blocks. So it kind of makes sense that after setup theme would be like the nice entry point to do it. That's how I remember it. But, well, all we're doing is looping through and enqueuing a style sheet that's sitting right here in our build folder. Now that the style sheet is enqueued, we can actually go in and we can write the CSS for this. So when we built our drop-down, small, medium, large of different responsive settings, it's kind of hard to say what is that based on, because in WordPress, there's breakpoints, sort of, but the block editor, doesn't really like giving us breakpoints, doesn't really like these sorts of responsive settings. So it gets a little hard to use them, but they actually exist in WordPress. And how we know is the columns block that we had. So let's take a look at this post that we built. If I put it into like a responsive mode, we know that there's responsive settings and breakpoints because columns have it, right? They stack at a certain point. What we want to do is we want to match those settings because, we really want this to be consistent. And this is a larger question in WordPress, which is why are there weird random breakpoints and why can't I edit them in theme JSON and why can't we all just get along on responsive design? And it kind of is what it is. So let me show you a little package here. This is in the WordPress Gutenberg. It's called the Base Styles package, and it's essentially a little Sass style sheet that handles utilities and mixins and things like that are used in WordPress and in the block editor. You can actually install this and use it. We don't need to because we're already in WordPress. So we can actually just import it, and our WordPress, like in our WordPress build process, will handle it. So we're actually going to do something closer to this right here, where we're actually going to import a few things. We're going to import the mixins and breakpoints. And so just to take a look at what these are, this is a breakpoints file that shows you all the breakpoints that are most used in WordPress. And here's all the ones that are really used in WordPress. You can tell by the comments here that there's just a lot of legacy stuff happening, and it is what it is. But we're going to use these breakpoints here, and we're going to not use all of them, but we're going to borrow them. But instead of just copying and pasting, we're going to import them. And then there's this mixin here, and I love this because it has some mobile first breakpoint mixins that we can use. So we're going to import this into our style sheet so that way we can use it. So we'll come up here, we'll say import at WordPress /base styles and /mixins. And we'll do another one for breakpoints. And what this means is that what we saw here, we now have available in our style sheet, and we can actually use the same breakpoints that work with WordPress, work with WordPress core. Okay, so we have WP block group and WP block column. Those are the two blocks we need to worry about here. We'll get rid of that sample code. And what we really want to do is check if they have responsive settings, because that was the class we added, right? So we only want to deal with blocks that actually have the class that we added. Then we have a few different breakpoints, and I'm going to copy these in and then we'll kind of go through them. Okay, so what we have here is our group block, our column block, make sure we have the responsive settings class turned on, and then if it also has this class. So we have the small breakpoint, so only display on small. So anything after break-medium, don't display. Then we have the small medium, so anything after the breakpoint of extra large, don't display. For quick reference, I'm using small as anything lower than this, and then I'm using large as anything above this, and then tablet is sort of that in between, I think. So you could really use any of these, but I'm picking these ones because they actually line up to what's being used in the columns block. So we have has responsive settings small, small, medium, and then as we get bigger, see, then we start doing, like if we only want it on medium, we're kind of doing a media query to hide it there and a mixin to hide it here, and it's not pretty. I actually am not a fan of doing breakpoints that are like minimum and maximum. I kind of just like layering on top, but I think this is kind of the quickest way to demo this. And one minor thing, we gotta make sure these class names match up here. This is actually supposed to be has responsive display, not has responsive setting. So we just want to make sure we're matching the class names that we added to our attributes here. All right, let's go to the front end. Let's test this out. So here's our block group. We've added those classes. I can see them here. So it's set to display on medium and large. And then if I go small, boom, it disappears, right? And look at this. The best part is right there where it disappears and it reappears. We're using the exact same breakpoint as the columns block. So we're going to match that perfectly, right? So we can actually do this and we can see that this is the group up here, the two columns. And the minute I go here, it's just the two columns. So using that breakpoint library is super helpful. Using the style sheet is super helpful. All this is really great. There's one problem left that we have to tackle with this. Okay, so let's dig into this last issue here, which is we've got our responsive settings working. The classes are loading, everything's looking good, but let's say I'm on the back end, I'm editing my content and I switch this to a small only for my block. Boom, it actually disappears, right? Because the styles that we put for the front end of our website are loading in the block editor because we're just kind of loading them globally. And I can see, the group is still here. It's just not showing up depending on the screen size that I'm looking at. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a new style sheet. We're going to call it editor.scss. So we're really following a lot of the same conventions that custom blocks would follow because WordPress Scripts really thinks we're making a custom block. So I don't really want to dig into Webpack config files and messing with things. I'm just going to kind of use the tool that I have, which is WordPress Scripts, and I know what it's going to do. It's just if I were making a block and I had a block.json, I wouldn't really be thinking about a lot of this, but in this case, since we're using it a little bit outside of its comfort zone, we are kind of paying attention to it. So we're going to make an editor.scss, and we're going to import it here in our index.js because that's going to tell Webpack, here's a style sheet, make sure you handle building it. And I'm going to save this. Then I'm going to come over here, to our editor. And I'm actually just going to copy the styles we had before. And I'm going to paste them in here. And we're going to save it for now. And then I can see here that it's building some new files. Because I've named these files style and editor, it doesn't really keep those names. Like I said, it thinks you're building a block. If we had a block.json file, it would know what to do with these files. We're just going to have to do a little extra thinking when we enqueue this extra piece of style right here. But first, what we're going to do is, now that we're on the back end, I don't want to display none everything. What I actually want to do is I'm going to do like half opacity. And what that's going to do is help us see that a block has like a responsive visibility setting, but it's not going to make it so hard that you can't edit it. And in fact, we're also going to add some additional conditionals right here. We're going to say, don't do this if the block is selected. And we're going to say, don't do this if the block has child selected. So what that's essentially saying is only load this kind of opacity CSS on a block if we're not actually editing it and if we're not actually editing some of its children, like some inner blocks that are nested inside of it. So we're going to save that. So we know it's all getting built from our build process. Now we just need to enqueue it properly. So let's come back to our enqueue. This WP enqueue block style kind of doesn't care if we're on the back or the front end. We basically need it to care. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to make it a little variable. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a simple check if is admin. And what this is really testing is, are we on the back end of WordPress or not? Because if we are, don't load the style.index that we've been loading. Load this other one called just index.css instead. So don't load this one, only load this one. Let me save that. And then if I come here, we can just see this is the one that's really for our editor because it has the opacity instead of display none. And then this one is the one we actually want on our front end. So let's go ahead and test that out. Let's see if it's working. But hopefully now that we have two separate style sheets being built here and we're, separating them from front to back end, everything should be working. We can kind of see how this looks in the editor. Okay, so here's our group block. So I'm going to go back to small only. So it doesn't disappear. That's a good thing. It's still here. We can still see what we're doing. We can still edit it. Now, if I click away, I get this kind of faded out look. That's the most simple visual signifier we could give that this is not going to show up on the front end of our site at this particular screen size. I come back in to edit it. Everything looks normal. So that looks good. Let's update and let's just make sure our front end style sheet is still loading and we didn't break anything there. And here's our front end. So as you can see, the group block is completely gone because we set it to small only. Let's go back into our size here and there it comes right back. And I just love how those breakpoints are pulled straight out of core, so it just kind of lines up right with those columns like that. So as a quick overview, we've enqueued some JavaScript into the block editor. We've enqueued some custom CSS for a few blocks. That's only going to load when those blocks are loaded. We have a different style sheet for the front or back end, depending on where we are on the site. And then we built out our index.js file with all of our custom attributes, our custom component to add InspectorControls and edit our block, a little function that adds some class names to our block, and the final registerBlockExtension call. I hope this was super helpful. I think this was a really great way to sort of explore how you can just add any setting really to any block. It doesn't have to be responsive design or anything like that. It's, when you look at any block, any core block, you think, man, I'd love to be able to turn a class on or off, but I don't want to use block styles because that's a pretty restrictive way to do it. You can only have one block style per block. This is a much more flexible, extendable, future-proof way to do it where you can have all sorts of different settings, toggle classes on your block, and then load up some CSS to basically override what's happening with a core block. So if you have any questions, if there's any parts you think I didn't go over as in-depth as you'd like, just let me know, leave a comment, ask anything, and I hope that this inspires you to add some custom block settings to any block.